I'd now like to welcome Melvyn Stokes, who joins us from Film Studies.
I'm going to talk about miscegenation in Hollywood film. Most of the discussion dealing with Barack Obama in terms of race is centered on the fact he's the first African American to become president of the United States. But it's also important to remember that when he was born in Hawaii in 1961, of a white mother and a black father, many American states still banned marriages between people of different races. There were still 22 American states that forbade interracial marriage in 1961. In 16 of these states, predominantly in the South, this prohibition lasted until 1967. Now, there had been laws against racial intermarriage in what would eventually become the United States, at least since 1661. But it was only during the Civil War that relationships between different races acquired a pejorative term all its own. Two Democratic Party fixers, the Linton Crosbys of their day, tried to undermine support for the Republican Party during the presidential election of 1864 with a classic dirty trick. They suggested that Lincoln and the Republican leadership were intent on promoting intermarriage between the races, a process to which they gave the name miscegenation, a term created from the Latin words miscere, to mix, and genus, race. Most cinema historians date the emergence of American cinema from a successful screening in New York City in April 1896. The early films were usually very short, but by the beginning of the 20th century, a number were beginning to play with the salacious potential of black-white sexual contact. In Edwin S. Porter's What Happened in the Tunnel, released in 1903, for example, a white man persistently flirts with a white woman in a train compartment. She and her black maid change places when the train enters a tunnel, and in the dark, the man accidentally kisses the black woman. After this first ever interracial screen kiss, there were a series of similar films, The Misdirected Kiss and A Kiss in the Dark, both in 1904, and Under the Old Apple Tree in 1907. These racial jokes on film petered out at the end of the first decade of the 20th century. American cinema is often represented, almost always in complex and mediated ways, frustrations and tensions within the wider society, or more precisely, the anxieties of the dominant section of that society, native-born whites. By the 1900s, this group was becoming increasingly concerned by the convergence of three major movements of population. The first of them, of course, beginning after Reconstruction, after the Civil War, is the movement of African Americans from the rural South to find jobs in northern and western industrial cities. The second movement, much smaller, is the movement of Japanese immigrants into California, perhaps 100,000 people in all. That prompts a lot of nativist sentiment, a lot of anti-Japanese feeling. And the third and largest movement of all is the immigration of so-called new immigrants from southern and eastern Europe, replacing, many millions of them replacing the immigrants who traditionally come from northern and western Europe. And in the first years of the 20th century, white Americans, faced with these changes in currents of population, tried to shore up their ascendancy by introducing broader restrictions on immigration. They also tried to preserve what once some defined as the purity of the white race by passing new laws against miscegenation. The release in 1915 of a film directed by David W. Griffith and eventually entitled The Birth of a Nation both reflected and shaped these concerns over racial intermingling. It had its origins in the work of a man called Thomas Dixon, Jr. Born in North Carolina at the end of the Civil War, Dixon has studied at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, where historian Herbert Baxter Adams taught that white Americans were descended from pure libertarian and democratic Anglo-Saxons. Dixon then pursued a dizzying variety of careers in turn: lawyer, politician, minister, and lecturer. He was on a lecture tour in 1901. He saw a performance of a staged version of Harriet Beecher Stowe's classic anti-slavery book, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Angered as a Southerner by Stowe's classic anti-slavery book, Dixon set out to write a series of novels demonstrating that really, from his point of view, the real victims of the Civil War and Reconstruction had not been blacks, they'd actually been whites in the South. And his novels, The Leopard's Spots, published in 1902, and particularly The Klansman, which came out in 1905, tried to put forward a new cultural myth of race relations that he hoped would replace Stowe's foundational text. In 1914, director Griffith, born like Dixon in the South, set out to turn Dixon's fiction into a spectacular motion picture. Lasting over 3 hours, making it the longest American film to that point, The Birth of a Nation told the story of how blacks had been content under the benevolent care of Southern slave owners. But, made free by the Civil War, they sought full equality in Southern society, including the right to marry white women. The film shows two major black characters pursuing white women, one of whom commits suicide to avoid the threat of rape, the other being imprisoned to await what the film describes as a forced marriage. Eventually, as the film tells it, the white men of the South formed the Ku Klux Klan to protect white women, and in alliance with northern whites, succeeded in defeating the armed blacks, disarming them, and preventing them from voting. Both Dixon and Griffith emphatically defended the birth of a nation as history. It was, of course, really a farrago of nonsense. It was historically wrong to suggest that African Americans had ever demanded the right to marry whites during the era of Reconstruction. What the film reflected was the disturbed racial fantasies of Thomas Dixon. But what it also both echoed and spoke to was the case of Jack Johnson. Johnson had become the first black boxer to win the heavyweight championship of the world in 1908. More than any other single factor, Johnson was responsible for drawing attention to the issue of miscegenation in the United States during the 1910s. In October 1912, he was arrested and charged with abducting Lucille Cameron, a white girl who was a former prostitute. In November, while still on trial for this, Johnson was charged under the Mann Act of 1910 with taking another white woman, a prostitute named Belle Schreiber, across state lines for immoral purposes. In December, 2 weeks after being acquitted on the first charge, he married Lucille Cameron. In his private life, Johnson seemed to be mounting a direct attack on the contemporary white prejudice against miscegenation. Inevitably, perhaps, he was found guilty under the Mann Act charge and sentenced to a year in jail. The intense publicity accorded Johnson's marriage to a white girl and the Johnson cases themselves appeared to give a powerful fillip to the contemporary movement to ban miscegenation by legal means. In 1913, in the wake of Johnson's marriage and trial, anti-miscegenation bills were introduced in half of the 20 states that still allowed interracial marriages. The Birth of a Nation as a film emerged from this background, blending together Dixon's sexual neuroses and the contemporary fallout of the Johnson case. This representation of miscegenation in Birth of a Nation cast a very long historical shadow. One of the effects of the film was to stimulate the production by Oscar Micheaux, a black filmmaker, of a movie called Within Our Gates, which came out in 1920. While Griffith's film represented black male assaults and white female virtue, Micheaux's film sets the record straight with its depiction of an attempted rape of a black woman by a white man. Of course, this was the reality of miscegenation under slavery, the actual persecution, the sexual abuse of black women by white overseers, masters, master sons, and so on. The vigorous campaign of protest against the Birth of a Nation by the NAACP and other organizations also encouraged Hollywood as an institution to avoid racial controversy wherever possible in future. And in 1927, the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America adopted something called the Don'ts and Be Carefuls, guidance for American filmmakers. And one of the don'ts, the absolute don'ts, was the depiction of miscegenation, very specifically described as sex relationships between the white and black races. And the production code adopted in 1930, often known as the Hays Code, reasserted this ban in exactly the same words. Now, that ban on miscegenation would be revoked only in 1956. In the years that followed, there's a cycle of new miscegenation films that may be trying to compete with television, try to be as titillating as they possibly could, but at the same time, they have to work within the limits of American opinion at the time. And for example, as late as April 1965, a Gallup poll found that 48% of all Americans nationwide approved of laws defining interracial marriage as a crime. But there are two things that changed the situation a little bit in 1967. One is that the Supreme Court, in a wonderfully named case called Loving versus Virginia, ruled attempts to impose legal bans on miscegenation as unconstitutional. And in December, Columbia Pictures released Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. Now, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner is one of those landmark films which, looking back, if you actually view it now, is terribly, terribly conservative. It's about a black doctor who wishes to marry the young, blonde Californian daughter of a newspaper owner. You can see Hollywood setting the scene here. And of course, the fact that the older couple are played by Spencer Tracy in his last film and Katharine Hepburn also helps carry the film. But what you've actually got here is a very conservative household in which the servants are barely any better than the kind of faithful souls the blacks represented in Griffith's Birth of a Nation. and you only see one kiss between the couple, and that's done indirectly in the film. You see it simply through the mirror of a taxi driver, with the taxi driver, who's white, disapprovingly looking at it at the same time. There are a couple of films that appear in the 1970s which are merely salacious, Mandingo and Drum. These are dreadful films. Mandingo is actually funny. I mean, it shouldn't be funny, but it is. I mean, it's a sad story, but at the same time it's so bad that it's positively amusing. But more recently, films such as Lone Star in 96, Jackie Brown in 97, Bulworth 98, Far From Heaven 2002, interracial relationships seem to be dealt with by Hollywood as naturally occurring events. That said, there are a number of directors who still don't altogether accept the idea of interracial relationships, one of whom is Spike Lee. And if you look at Spike Lee's 1991 film Jungle Fever, this is actually a polemic against the idea of interracial marriage, which Spike Lee is convinced operates to the detriment of African Americans. So even after, almost a century after the Birth of a Nation, and I'm organising a conference looking at the impact of Birth of a Nation, and particularly at black opposition to Birth of a Nation in June of next year, but a century after Birth of a Nation, some of the old stereotypes and the old issues of miscegenation haven't entirely disappeared from American screens and from Hollywood productions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Melvyn.